Hello, I'm Antoinette LaFarge. Today I'm going to be talking about fictive museums as part of this conference's larger consideration of the forms that the modern museum has taken over the last century, as well as what forms it might morph into in future. I'll give an overview of the history of these fictive institutions, looking particularly at how they creatively respond to the idea of the modern museum and its functions for Western culture. I will be drawing heavily on Chapter 4 of my recent book, Sting in the Tail, Art, Hoax and Provocation. Visual artists spend part of their career negotiating entry into the museum, usually through intermediaries such as curators and collectors. Frustration with this top-down and heavily gated system has led a number of artists to push back with various forms of institutional critique. One path they have taken is to declare themselves as institutions, in effect jumping themselves up from the bottom of the standard hierarchy, seen here on the left. Notice that when the artist is the institution, as shown on the right, they keep control over the artworks as well as how those artworks become public. They exist at the center of a web rather than at the bottom of a hierarchy of cultural power. I discuss fictive institutions in my book Sting in the Tail as one variant of what I call fictive art, also known as parafiction or superfiction. As a form of visual art, it is separate from similar literary genres like fake memoirs. The central narrative serves to generate many of the objects that are part of the project, and that serve to secure it as real and factual. The claim to factuality means that deception lies at the heart of the project, and this also differentiates it from other alternate world projects like fantasy and games that don't pretend to be real. Probably the best known of all fictive institutional projects, as well as one of the earliest, is Marcel Brodter's Museum of Modern Art, Department of Eagles, from the early 1970s. Like other fictive or conceptual museums, it did not conform to tradition in such basic matters as having a permanent physical site, a permanent collection, or a professional staff. At the same time, it borrowed heavily from both the style and functions of the modern museum, for example in its use of display vitrines, as shown here in one of its installations. Other museal elements include its graphic self-promotion through logos and official signage, its organization into thematic wings or departments, and its promulgation of museum-branded artworks like the gold ingot at Wright. Brodter's ingots were not only an early sign of the enormous expansion of museum shops that took place in the third quarter of the 20th century, but were also hybrid objects that emerged as a byproduct of that development, the limited edition artist's work made especially for the museum shop, to be sold alongside more traditional forms of mass wares like coffee mugs and scarves. And as with other contemporary artists whose work both signifies and functions as money, like the late J.S.G. Boggs's dollar bills, Brodter's ingots were an embodiment and critique of those processes in the art world that were already turning artworks into a form of speculative currency, a process that has greatly accelerated since then. Comparatively few artists of fictive museums focus primarily on such economic aspects, however. More typical are two other early fictive museums. The first of these is the Museum of Contemporary Ideas, invented in 1989 by the Scottish-Australian artist Peter Hill. At the time he was publishing and editing the art magazine Alba, where he received endless press releases from art institutions around the world that he had never visited. It occurred to him that he could sustain the facade of an entire museum rather inexpensively through fictional press releases like the one shown here. And several art publications at the time covered the MOCI as if it were a real museum. Peter has also invented a number of fictional artists and artist collectives whose work is represented in the collection of the MOCI. Indeed, he has gone to great lengths to create entire oeuvres for these artists, and he shows them at international art fairs under the auspices of the museum. Peter develops complex backstories for his invented artists. As you can see in the image at right, there is even a serious rivalry imagined between two of the MOCI artists, Hal Jones and Herb Sherman. Hal Jones, seen here, vandalizing a painting by Herb Sherman. For Peter, these inventions offer a way to be a novelist in 3 dimensions, creating a fully imagined art world that happens to physically coincide with ours. This positions the fictive museum as a form of speculative fiction that plays out in real space and time, allowing us not simply to speculate about the possibility of such a museum and such artists, but actually to encounter them. This experiential dimension is a prominent aspect of fictive institutions and implicitly critiques the rather narrow kinds of experiences afforded by many museums. The other pioneer of fictive institutions that I'd like to mention here is the German photographer Ulrich Tilman, whose Klaus-Peter Schnüttger-Webs museum was realized in various ways in collaboration with the artists Bettina Gruber and Maria Vedder starting in 1986. Tilman, who styled himself the museum's director, was interested in targeting the typical collecting strategies of most museums, and so brought a wide range of found and ready-made objects into his museum, each with its own story. Like Peter Hill, Tilman was attuned to the vital role that documentation plays in the contemporary art world, and in 1987 he published a collection of press materials, posters, and other documents testifying to the museum's early existence. Over the following decades, he kept his conceptual museum going as an evolving archive focused on documenting the life and work of the non-existent Schnüttger-Webs. The Schnüttger-Webs oeuvre was largely fabricated through a process of appropriation, reworking, and reattribution, which Tilman described as an allegory of artistic production. A salient aspect of both Hill and Tilman's projects is the way the artists are using their fictive institutional framework to move beyond the limitations of the artistic persona and the artistic pseudonym. While pseudonyms have allowed visual artists to explore working in different styles and media, there is a presumption that they will be no more than a thin and probably temporary shield under which the artist continues to see the world largely through a singular perspective. But by inventing heteronyms, that is, artists with variant personalities, full biographies, and substantial oeuvres, who are themselves represented by authoritative-sounding institutions, Hill and Tilman extend how authorship can function for visual artists. And by positioning themselves as curators or directors rather than artists within these projects, both Hill and Tilman are afforded entry into that objective-sounding third-person perspective on their own work that is not ordinarily open to artists, who are expected to speak in the first person. Here indeed is another path to Rimbaud's Je suis un autre, I am an other. These artists of fictive institutions rely on metonymy as an operating principle. That is, the parts, the logos, the press releases, the images, stand in for the whole, allowing the viewer to assume an entire museum enterprise that does not actually exist. This is perhaps most clearly seen in the wave of fictive institutions that arose with the advent of the Internet in the 1990s. Some of these are museums, but others position themselves as archives or research institutions, like the 2 websites shown here. Like the Contemporary Museum, they appear to carry out a range of activities, from artistic experimentation to lectures, workshops, and publications, all documented on the web. For example, the New York artist Lenore Mallon invented her new Society for Universal Harmony, in part as an homage to the actual 18th century physician Franz Anton Mesmer and his Société de l'Harmonie Universelle. In 2006, she published a comprehensive book about the new society, positioning herself as an outsider who had simply found out about the society and was giving a journalistic account of it. She even interviewed the contemporary scientist Affey Mesmer, actually one of her own alter egos. With publications such as those shown here, which are all fictive to some degree, although not evidently so, artists appropriated one of the key nexuses of cultural valuation, the scholarly monograph. Each documents a prominent aspect of the fictive institution, its history and activities in the case of the New Society, its exquisite collections in the case of the Museum at Purgatory, and its metaphysical research in the case of the Museum of Jurassic Technology. The physical solidity of these books helps to sustain the idea that their associated institutions are equally actual and credible. In a small number of cases, the fictive institution has gone full circle and been realized in ways that make it all but impossible to fully distinguish from the traditional museum. In some ways, this isn't terribly surprising, given that nearly all of these fictive institutions involve the creation of a collection of artworks of some kind, the oeuvres of inexistent artists, for example, or documentation of fake events. The Museum of Jurassic Technology in Culver City, California, may be the most famous of these. It has been housed in a storefront for some 30 years, but its displays continue to be a misleading combination of fact and fiction. Here, at lower right, for example, is the museum's exhibit about the D-prong Mori, a bat that is said to be able to echolocate in the X-ray spectrum and thereby fly through most solid objects. Or take the Museum of Innocence, which was opened in Istanbul in 2012 by the Turkish novelist and Nobel laureate Orhan Pamuk. This museum is the realization of a fictional museum Pamuk had created in his 2008 novel, The Museum of Innocence. Indeed, Pamuk had conceived the novel with its fictional museum and the actual museum at the same time, and had bought the nondescript 3-story building that would house the museum in 1999, almost a decade before he published his novel. From that point on, the novel and the museum co-shaped each other. The museum's collections center on ordinary objects and their human significance, with a focus on life in Istanbul in bygone decades. Although to some extent Pamuk thought of his novel as a catalogue of the museum without pictures, he eventually published a separate, more traditional catalogue of the museum collection. For him, all of his creations, the novel, the museum, the catalogue, are different forms of literature. Here we see most clearly another element that seems central to the way visual artists think about and realize their fictive institutional projects. They provide an expansive forum for storytelling, one that goes well beyond the kinds of stories ordinarily acceptable in the art world, and especially in museums. In particular, by centering their projects on fiction rather than fact, artists are released from the tyranny of biography and the historicizing mindset that attempts to place each artist neatly within a critically determined movement, style, or genre. I have only touched here on a fraction of the fictive institutions that have been created by artists in the past half-century. I invite you to the pleasure of finding more of them on your own, and leave you with this final thought from my book. One of the fascinations of this work is its extravagance, the sheer amount of labor that goes into creating and then sustaining these fictions. In its expansive deceptions, fictive art produces complicated forms of doubt and pleasure, and doubt is one of our chief shields against authoritarianism or that narrowing of thought that leads to doctrinaire thinking. Fictive art asks us to believe, only to deliberately undercut that belief. It teaches us how to productively and pleasurably engage in uncertainty. Thank you very much.